Today we are going to set up Linux in a multi-boot configuration. We want to set up 4 operating systems. We will start with Linux Mint, then install Zorin OS, then Fedora and then Manjaro. Finally, we are going to make the booting process a bit prettier by installing rEFInd instead of the default grub as the boot manager. My name's Niels and you're on headbring.dev. Okay, before we get started, I first set up a virtual machine. In my case, I'm using Hyper-V, but of course you can do this on any physical machine as well. Just remember that if it is a physical machine, you will need a physical stick or drive to boot from during the installation process. So in this case, I'm setting up my Hyper-V virtual machine. I will just name it rEFInd. Select generation 2 and the default settings for memory, give it internet connectivity so that we could download or can download packages from the internet. Create a virtual hard disk. In this case, the size of 127 gigabytes is completely fine for our use case. I will be giving each operating system around 20 gigabytes to work with. So given that we have 4 operating systems, that will leave us at around 80 gigabytes used. So 127 gigabytes should be more than enough. I will also select our first operating system ISO here, and I will select Mint as the first operating system. Why Mint? Well, Mint has a live environment which you can boot into, where you can also run certain applications. And one of those applications that I want to run is GParted, to be able to partition our hard drive to prepare it for all of those, or for those 4 different operating systems. So after the VM has been created, I will first of all disable secure boot. That's something we will not need right now. If your system does have compatible secure boot that works with Linux, then you can of course use that for your system. On my virtual machine, I will disable it. And going to firmware, we can also make sure that the boot order is correct. So we want to boot initially from our DVD drive, which is selected in this case, so that's correct. You would check these settings in your BIOS probably to make sure the boot order is correct. I will then connect to and start the virtual machine, and of course initially we only have the option to boot from the DVD, so we will see the setup wizard here. Wait a bit for Linux Mint to be up and running, and there we are. Okay, so I will immediately start GParted and we will create a partition table first, a GPT partition table in this case, and I will go ahead and create the first partition. Now the first partition is our EFI or ESP partition. So I'm choosing a size of 1 gigabyte. 1 gigabyte isn't strictly necessary. You could also choose less. I think in the end we are between 50 and 100 megabyte disk space used on this partition. But of course, as you increase the number of kernels and operating systems you make available through this partition, the amount of space used increases as well. So just to be on the safe side, I chose 1 gigabyte. If you are more constrained regarding your storage, you can also get away with less, maybe 500 megabytes or 256, depending on how many operating systems you do end up installing. I will give this partition a name of EFI and a label of EFI just to be able to recognize it later a bit more easily, let's say. And I will choose a file system of FAT32 to make it compatible as the EFI partition so that the content can actually be read. Let's apply that change first, and then let's immediately go ahead and manage the flags. That's something you shouldn't forget. If you don't have these flags, the system will not be able to boot. So we will choose boot, and as you can see immediately, we also got ESP checked automatically. So that is correct. You want boot and ESP checked on your EFI partition. Now I will go ahead and create the partitions for our 4 operating systems, starting with Mint. As mentioned before, I'm allocating 20 gigabytes of disk space for each partition. So I will choose the partition name label Mint with 20 gigabytes and file system ext4. So those settings will be the same for all 4 operating systems. 20 gigabytes, file system ext4, and then the partition name and label corresponding to the name of the operating system. In the end, your partition table should look something like this. Again, we have the first partition, which is the EFI partition, file system FAT32, size for me 1 gigabyte with the flags boot and ESP, and then 1 additional partition for each operating system that you want to install. So for me, that is Mint, Zorin, Fedora, and Manjaro. And each partition for me has 20 gigabytes. If you have more disk space available, you can of course increase that size depending on your need and your use case. Later it will also be possible, although not shown in this video, to mount shared partitions on each of those operating systems. That is something I suggest not doing during the installation process, but manually editing etc fstab, so the file system table for each operating system after it's up and running. Apply all of those changes as well, and then we are done with the partition management and we'll go ahead and install Linux Mint. I will quickly go through the installer. Most of the default settings are fine for my use case. For installation type, this is important. For every operating system, you will want to choose manual partitioning or in this case, something else. If you choose the other options like erase disk or install alongside, it may not properly use the partitions you just created, or with erase disk, it will of course erase the entire disk, which is also not what we want. So you will want to change to something else in this case, or manual partitioning if it's named something else, to be able to configure which partitions are used and which aren't. The Linux Mint installer will not require you to manually configure the mount point for your rEFInd partition. As you can see, type it already detected as rEFInd, and therefore it will automatically mount this partition to /boot/rEFInd without you having to manually configure that mount point. Remember, for Linux Mint we want to use dev SDA2 because it's the first partition that we created specifically for Linux Mint. So here you will now go ahead, click change. It is an ext4 journaling file system. I will select format the partition and I will mount this to the root. So just put / here, and there will be a warning informing you that you want to change the partition size, which is not the case. I could not get rid of this warning even if I put the size to the correct size. As you can see, there was a 1 megabyte mismatch here. However, if you do see this warning, you can just click go back. In this case, we don't want to make any changes to the partition table, and it still set the mount point and the formatting flag correctly. So I'm not sure if this is a bug or something else I did wrong, but you can just click on go back to not write any changes, and then this should be fine. Finally, once you're happy with that, click install now. It will ask you to confirm all of the changes, and in this case, the only change it's listing is that partition 2 will be formatted as ext4, and that is something that we expect. That is something we just selected, so that is correct, and we will click continue. It will now ask you to set your time zone, so set whatever time zone you're in, and of course your personal details, including the user account. I will choose login automatically because that makes it a bit easier to work with the system, because we will be rebooting quite a lot later, so no need to put in the password every time, but of course you can choose whatever you need. Let's wait for the installation process to finish, and once that's done we can restart. In this case, Hyper-V would automatically remove the installation medium for us. If you're on a physical computer, you would probably want to remove the USB stick or whatever other boot medium you used now. And there we are. After the reboot, it immediately booted us into Linux Mint, which probably makes sense as it's the only operating system we have available right now. But of course, in the future, we do want to install multiple. So let's set that up now. First of all, let me show you the boot rEFInd directory, what's in there at the moment. And as you can see, we have two entries. We have one for boot, one for Ubuntu. Boot will be your fallback bootloader, and then Ubuntu will be the actual Linux Mint bootloader that it's set up during installation. Note that it's not optimal that it's named Ubuntu here, even though it's Linux Mint. You will note that for Zorin, it will also be called Ubuntu. So if you want to keep those directories intact, and if you want to keep a reference to those directories, you will probably want to rename those before installing any other operating systems of the same family, because they may not have the correct name or the distribution name as the bootloader's name. Nevertheless, I will immediately go ahead and install rEFInd. rEFInd is of course our boot manager that we want to use instead of the kind of list view that grub offers. rEFInd is a bit prettier and more customizable, let's say. And for Linux Mint, it will ask you to automatically install to the ESP. If it didn't ask you during the installation process, you can also manually trigger this command by running rEFInd install. So checking what's inside the directory now, you can see we have two additional directories in boot rEFInd. We have rEFInd and tools. And if we check rEFInd, you can see that we have an additional bootloader configuration inside this directory, which is of course rEFInd. You can also run rEFInd install again if you want to upgrade rEFInd because there is a new version available. Then you just run this command and it will update all of the files accordingly. I will immediately do some housekeeping here, because now that we have rEFInd installed, we don't want to use the built-in bootloaders or boot managers anymore. So I will create an ignore directory, and then I will move boot and I will move Ubuntu into this ignore directory. Please note that immediately I'm renaming the Ubuntu directory to Mint. And once you're done with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the rEFInd.conf file. So this is our configuration file for rEFInd, and you can see a lot of different options that you can configure here. Now the default will work. You don't need to change anything if you don't want to. I just want to quickly move through these options so you can see what's available, right? So you can customize timeouts, logging, different system settings, and of course, most of the options for the UI like icons and tools that are shown, banners that are shown, and so on and so forth. If you want to, you can also go ahead and enable mouse support if you want to use your mouse on the boot screen. Let me do that in this case, just as an example. And then what I will also do is I will update the don't scan dirs. And what I will do is I will add, in addition to the default directories, which are indicated by the plus, I will also ignore the /efi/ignore directory on the ESP partition. That's the directory we just created. So with that change, the default Linux Mint boot configuration will no longer show up as an option in rEFInd. I will show you what that looks like in a bit. Going through the rest of the file, you can see that there are many more options available. You can also manually configure menu entries if you want to. Usually rEFInd will automatically detect all of the operating systems that are available, but if you need to manually configure some of the settings for a boot entry, you can do that here. Okay, so let's go ahead and shut down the machine. That will give me a chance to verify the boot order. In this case, you would do that in the BIOS of your motherboard. Essentially, you want to make sure that rEFInd, first of all, shows up as an entry, and then second of all, that rEFInd is the first boot option before any others. And as you can see here, for Hyper-V, it did it automatically. So that is correct. We do want to boot from rEFInd. So I will now go ahead and start the machine again. And you can see it immediately booted into rEFInd, and we can see the rEFInd UI here. We only have one option available, Linux Mint, which is also correct. And then you can see below the Linux Mint icon, we have some other options like information about rEFInd, shutdown and reboot, boot to UEFI BIOS, and so on. Let me boot back into Linux Mint for now and show you what it looks like if we didn't create that ignore folder. So I'm moving boot and mint back out of the ignore directory and restarting the machine one more time. And you can see that now we have more options available. We get the mint grub option, then we get a fallback bootloader. That's what rEFInd calls the bootloader found in the boot directory. And then finally we have the Linux Mint boot option. Let me undo that change and move those back to the ignore directory. And now checking one more time, you can see we have just the options that we want. Okay, now onto the second operating system. We want to install Zorin, and you need to make sure, of course, that now you're booting from the DVD drive or the ISO again, depending on what your installation medium is. And here you can see we are booting into Zorin, and it will immediately start the installer. So I will choose just the default settings. In this case, I will check don't participate in the census, but you can choose whatever you want. And again, here it is important that you are choosing something else. Similar to Linux Mint, Zorin OS will also detect the EFI partition by itself, so you don't need to configure anything there. And then we will go onto dev SDA3 and change the mount point to root and configure it as an ext4 file system. Again, it may warn you about changing the size of the partition. You should not do that. You should go back and ignore those changes, and then it should just confirm that it will erase or format the partition number 3, in this case as ext4, and do no other changes. Please note that for all operating systems, I am selecting dev SDA as the device for the bootloader installation. So each operating system will install its own bootloader, even though we have rEFInd available. That's no problem. We can fix that using the ignore directory that I created before. Once again, I'm selecting my time zone and my name and password. And let's wait a couple seconds for this installation to finish. Restart once it's done. And we are booted into Zorin immediately. As you can see, upon restart, it automatically booted into the Zorin boot manager instead of rEFInd. We will fix that in a bit. Let's work with the systems and configure the EFI configuration first. So using lsblock, you can make sure that the mount points are set correctly. You want dev SDA 1 to be boot EFI, and then in this case, dev SDA 3 to be the root mount point, which is correct. And I will go ahead, shut down the machine, and once again, move rEFInd to the top and start the machine again. And once that's done, you can see now we have more boot options again. And one of those is Zorin, so I will boot back into Zorin, move to the boot EFI directory, and here maybe it makes sense to rename boot to mint boot to not cause any conflicts, because Zorin also created a boot directory, and then I will move boot into Zorin boot in the ignore directory and move Ubuntu into ignore Zorin. Okay, and once you're done, your boot EFI directory should only contain 3 directories, ignore, rEFInd, and tools, and the ignore directory should include mint, mint boot, Zorin, and Zorin boot. And when we reboot one more time, rEFInd looks correct again. We have the boot option for Linux Mint, and then we have the boot option for Zorin. And that also means that we are ready for our third operating system. I'm selecting Fedora 40 now, and we'll go through the installation process again. Here, one more time, it's important to choose the custom storage configuration. I'm choosing advanced custom as well. And for this kind of installer, it will not automatically set the mount point for your EFI partition. So in this case, you need to set it manually to /boot/EFI. And then in this case, we want to mount partition 4 as the root for Fedora. And that's all. Once that's done, you can wait for the installation process to finish and restart the machine. And as you can see, it overrode the boot priority again. So in this case, we are booting from the Fedora grub instead of rEFInd. I will choose Fedora manually here and start the setup to set up my username and password. And as you can see, if I run lsblock, the ISO was not ejected automatically, so I will do that now. And running it again, we now have the correct configuration, meaning that on dev SDA4 we have our file system root, and then on dev SDA1 we have our boot EFI partition. Let's do the same changes we did for the other two operating systems as well. So I will move to boot EFI and move boot and Fedora to the ignore directory, so that once again we only have 3 directories within boot EFI, that being ignore, rEFInd and tools. And then ignore should now have 6 entries, 2 for each operating system. And once we go ahead and reboot, we are thrown back into rEFInd with 3 options here: Mint, Zorin and Fedora. So far so good, that's all looking fine. Let me shut down the computer and attach the final ISO. Let me boot the machine and we should be thrown back into the Manjaro installer. Start that up and we can immediately select install Manjaro, select the correct time zone for your location, go through that. And once again, very important, select manual partitioning here, otherwise it may erase other partitions or your disk, and we don't want that. And similar to the Fedora installer, we need to manually configure the mount point for the EFI partition, so /boot/EFI, and for Manjaro's root partition, which is dev SDA5 in our case, as /. Once again, configure your username and password. In this case, it's asking for an office suite. I don't want an office suite. And finally, click install. Once that's done, you can restart. Okay. Checking with the console again, you can see that the mount points are set correctly, and we will go ahead and move the boot and the Manjaro directories in boot EFI to ignore again, so that they don't cause any additional icons to show up in our rEFInd screen. And that should be the final picture you have. So we have in boot EFI, we have ignore, rEFInd and tools. And then in the ignore directory, there are 8 entries: Fedora, Fedora boot, Manjaro, Manjaro boot, Mint, Mint boot, and Zorin, Zorin boot. So 2 for each operating system that we just installed. As you can see, when we reboot, we are thrown back into the Manjaro bootloader or boot manager. So let me shut down the machine and adjust the Hyper-V settings, because Manjaro is probably the first option in the boot order now. So let's move rEFInd up to the top again, save those settings and start the machine. And as you can see now, everything's looking exactly as expected. We have 4 options for our 4 operating systems, and we can boot any from this screen. So the functionality is done now. However, I think we can make the screen look a bit prettier. So let's install a theme now. The way you do that is, first of all, you head over to GitHub, for example, and you find some themes that you would like to use. Usually you can just search for rEFInd and some options will come up for different themes. You will have to click through, check some of the images to see if that's something you want or not. And something else you can check is if the theme contains all icons for the operating systems you are using. So for example, here I'm looking at rEFInd minimal. So let's go through and search for all of the operating systems we have. Linux Mint is available, Zorin is not available, Fedora is available, and Manjaro is available. So this theme would use the default Linux icon for Zorin, for example. Maybe we can find another theme that has the Zorin icon available as well. So let's see, we have Luke Child's rEFInd ambience here. Let's open icons and check one more time. We have Mint, we have Zorin, we have Fedora, and we have Manjaro. So maybe ambience could be a theme that we might want to use. The installation instructions are very simple. You just create a themes directory and git clone the repository into that directory. And then at the end of your rEFInd.conf file, you will include the theme.conf inside this directory. And that should be it. Let's restart. And that already looks quite a bit better. However, there is an issue. As you can see, we only have 3 options available. Manjaro is missing somehow. So let's see what's causing that. Also note that during the reboot, Fedora has apparently installed several software updates, and that caused rEFInd to also show additional Fedora icons. So let's move back to boot EFI and see what happened. And yeah, Fedora created a new bootloader entry. So we will move Fedora into the ignore directory again. Restarting one more time, we can see that the configuration is correct now. However, we still cannot see Manjaro. If you remove the theme again and restart, you can see that it's working as expected. So the default configuration is okay. The fact that we can't see the Manjaro icon could also be a bug with the theme. So let's see. Maybe we can try another theme to see if the issue goes away. So let's try the rEFInd minimal theme. Include the theme.conf in our rEFInd.conf and reboot the machine. And now you can see that it seems to be working fine. So the rEFInd minimal theme seems to be working. The rEFInd ambience theme seems like it does not show the Manjaro icon. Let's check something else though. We installed rEFInd on Linux Mint through apt. And checking the version that we installed, you can see that it's 0.13.2-1. Going to SourceForge, you can see that 0.13.2 is from 2021. The latest available version is 0.14.2. So we can go ahead and either download the deb file manually and install it on Linux Mint, or we boot into another distribution like Fedora and use DNF to install rEFInd. And let's see which version we get here. So running DNF install rEFInd, note the capitalization here. You can see that DNF actually contains the latest available version. So here we do get 0.14.2, and using rEFInd install, it will upgrade the installation we have. Using EFI boot manager, you can also make sure that rEFInd is the first option in the boot order, which it is in this case, although the rEFInd install command will also make sure that rEFInd is the first option in the EFI boot manager order. After that's done, let's try and reboot one more time to see what happened. And we are still on the rEFInd minimal theme, so you can see we are missing the icon for Zorin. However, now there are 4 more icons in the bottom bar. Previously we only had shutdown, but now we have the default icons of info, shutdown, reboot, and open BIOS. So that's also not something we want. I will let you know that these 4 additional icons should not be there, and that is actually a bug tracked in merge request number 52. However, this merge request is open as of the time of recording. Maybe when you see this video, this merge request has been merged, and the newest version of rEFInd has fixed the issue. Nevertheless, let's try the ambience theme again because it contains icons for all of our operating systems. And as you can see, this is working as expected now, even though we do see these 4 additional icons. But we can see Linux Mint, Zorin, Fedora, and Manjaro now. We can properly navigate through all of those icons, so that is all working as expected. Congratulations, you've just set up multiple Linux distributions to boot from using rEFInd as a fancy boot manager. If you have any further questions, suggestions, or ideas, feel free to write a comment down below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.